Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jillian and I am the host and creator of Court Junkie, which is a true crime podcast that covers criminal cases and trials. In today's video, I thought it would be fun to go behind the scenes a little bit and tell you guys about people who have reached out to me about different episodes that I have put out. And I'm talking about people who are pretty close to the case, whether they worked on the case in some sort of legal capacity, whether they were a witness in one of the trials, or maybe they knew the victim or the perpetrator, that kind of thing. And it happens more often than you would probably think, and something that I was really surprised by when I first started putting out this podcast. So every time I am writing one of my scripts or researching a case, I always think, what if a victim's family member, for example, is going to listen to this? Am I getting all of the facts right? Am I being sensitive to what happened? And, am I accurately explaining things? Like, I want to make sure that in the event that someone close to the case does listen, that, they can come back and say, yes, you did get it right. I always say that you never know who's listening, and that is so true. You just really don't. And so anytime you put something out into the public, you never know whose ears are going to hear it. And I think that that's a really good rule of thumb that we as podcasters, really do think about, or at least should think about, when we are putting stuff out there in the world. So I came up with a little list of people who have reached out to me, and I figured I'd share it with you, in the hopes that you guys would be interested in hearing about it. So first, I want to go back to my very first episodes where I covered the Melissa Kalzinski case. So this was a case of a 22-year-old daycare worker who in 2009, a 16-month-old boy that she had been, watching under her care at this daycare, ended up passing away with some sort of head injury. Melissa Kalzinski ended up confessing and telling the officers that she threw the child down on the ground, but she later said her confession was coerced and that it was, in fact, false. So she has been in prison now ever since then. Kathleen Zellner, whom you may have heard of, is her attorney, and she is trying to get her at least a new trial based on some new information that has since come out, which may show that the child actually passed away from a prior head injury or condition, and that it actually wasn't the result of anything that Melissa did. So when I very first started Court Junkie, I had no idea what I wanted to do with the podcast, to be completely honest with you. So when you go back and if you listen to episode 1 and episode 2, just know I had no clue where Court Junkie was going to go. I didn't know if I was going to just cover the Melissa Kalzinski case and kind of, add on to it and see through it to the end. There were these post-conviction hearings that were being held for her, and there was a chance that she could get out. So I didn't know if I was going to follow it to that end, or if Court Junkie would eventually turn into a podcast where I covered a different case each episode. Spoiler alert, it was the latter. But anyway, I decided to cover the Melissa Kalzinski case because it was a case that was relatively close to me. It was about an hour and a half away, the hearings that were taking place. And so I decided to go to the hearings, and, I took copious notes, and I introduced myself to Melissa's family, and, talked to some other reporters and some other people who were there. And I just really ingrained myself into this case. And so that's what episodes 1 and 2 of Court Junkie are basically about. They're all about this case. So after putting it out, I was really nervous. First of all, you just never think that when you put something out there that it's going to make its way back to, like I said, people who are close to the case. And in this instance, a father whose child went to that same daycare where this happened reached out to me and said that, he listened to the podcast and he and his wife remember when all of this went down, and he'd love to talk to me further about it. So I actually met up with him, and, we met for maybe about a half hour or so. And he told me that they knew Melissa, that they thought she was great, and that they didn't really believe that she had anything to do with this child's death, and that they believe that it was accidental as well. And he also had some things to say about, I believe, the police department where this occurred, and the district attorney's office, and that sort of thing. So that was my first instance of somebody contacting me saying that they had some sort of involvement in the case. And like I said, I was shocked because, it was a very small podcast. I didn't have very many downloads at the time, so I'm not really sure how he heard about it, but he did. So even more nerve-wracking, in episode 5, I covered the case of Erika Parsons. And Erika Parsons was a teenager who was reported missing 2 years after her disappearance. So, I think we all remember the Kaylee Anthony case where Casey Anthony, her mom, didn't report her missing for, I believe it was 31 days. Well, Erika was 13 years old at the time of her disappearance, and she was never reported missing by her adoptive family. It wasn't until her adoptive brother went into the police station and told them that he hadn't seen his adoptive sister in 2 years, and that he thought that his parents may, have done something to her. At the time of the episode, Erika still hadn't been found, and the case was still very much an open case. I do believe that Erika's adoptive parents were in jail at the time, but not for anything regarding Erika's disappearance and eventual death. They were in jail for fraud charges because they were still accepting checks from the government, even though they no longer had Erika in their, custody in their household. So after I released that episode, I was absolutely shocked when Erika's biological mother contacted me on Facebook. She said she had heard the episode and she asked if we could talk. And I remember we spoke on the phone. I think it was for about 45 minutes. And she gave me some more information about the case and told me that, she was in the process of getting her daughter back when her daughter disappeared. And, she was just absolutely desperate to know what had happened to her daughter. So that was pretty shocking that she had contacted me and wanted to talk further about it. I think it was just a few weeks later when Erika's body was found and her adoptive parents would eventually be charged with the murder. That is a case I think is still ongoing, but it's been a while since I looked into it. But yeah. In episode 28, I covered the Charleston church shooting and the trial of Dylann Roof. So this occurred back in June of 2015. Dylann Roof was a white supremacist mass shooter who walked into a church, pretended to be there for a Bible study, and then opened fire, killing 9 African Americans. It was an absolutely horrible, horrible case. And I remember, even in researching it, just being in tears over it and kind of agonizing over whether or not I gave enough to all of the victims, because there was 9 of them. And, sometimes in an hour podcast, especially one where you're trying to talk about the legal ramifications of what happened, and you're trying to discuss what, evidence was presented, and there's so much information, sometimes it's hard to really be able to paint a good picture about the victims. So in this case, the jury foreman emailed me, and I actually have his email right in front of me so I could read it to you guys. But he said, "I heard your podcast on the Dylann Roof trial. It was moving, and as the jury foreman, I was unfortunate to live the trial all too closely, as the other jurors and alternate jurors did. I spoke out a year later and have had many sleepless nights about the horror of the case. Thank you for your portrayal of the facts and coverage of the case, and sincerity and concern you showed for the victims and their families." So this was an email that really meant a lot to me, because here was somebody who was there at trial every single day, who, like he says, had to live out the horrors of what had happened to all of the victims. He saw all of the evidence that was presented against Dylann Roof, and then, ultimately had to decide Dylann Roof's fate. So the fact that he had taken the time to, one, listen to my podcast and then reach out to me, complimenting my coverage of it was really a career highlight for me. Absolutely. In episode 47, I covered the life and death of real estate agent Beverly Carter. And I don't want to say that this is, one of my favorite episodes to work on, but I will explain that in a second. So Beverly Carter was a real estate agent in Arkansas, and she was senselessly murdered while showing a home to someone she thought was a potential home buyer. But that person was really intending on robbing and killing her, which they did. So I spoke with her son, Carl, for the episode, and that's kind of why I say that it was one of my favorite ones to work on, because her son, Carl Jr., is such an inspiring human being. He not only spoke so graciously and eloquently about his mom and shared the story of the heartbreak of what happened to her, but he also has made it his life's mission to try and make sure that something like that doesn't happen again. He has a foundation that he named after his mom, where he actually goes and speaks to real estate agent groups and talks to them about safety in the real estate business, which I think is a very important thing that he's doing. And not only did I speak to Carl Jr. for the episode, but then he ended up coming to Chicago for, I believe it was for a conference a few months later. And we met up at a coffee shop, had a cup of coffee, and, talked a little bit more about that. So during that coffee shop meeting with Carl, he told me that it was almost therapeutic for him talking about everything again, and, that he was glad that he was able to come onto the podcast. So that really was a powerful moment for me. And aside from Carl Jr. and his reaction to the episode, a woman who did Beverly's hair, so her hairstylist, reached out and told me what a wonderful person Beverly was and how she would remember seeing Carl Jr. at the hair salon as well. In episode 64, I covered the case of Gennaro Sanchez, and I titled it, His Name Was Gennaro Sanchez. So Gennaro Sanchez was an East Central University college student who was murdered by another college student named Jared Murray. At the time that I came across this case, Jared's interview with police had gone viral because of how calm and just kind of terrifying he was as he explained murdering Gennaro to the detectives. And when I saw the interrogation tapes and saw how that went viral, like that part of the case, it made me want to cover the case from Gennaro's side of things. So I spoke with Gennaro's mom, who was very outspoken about the case, and I did an episode from her perspective. So after I released the episode, I was contacted by quite a few of Gennaro's friends, which I thought was great. You could tell that this was somebody who was really missed and was really loved. And one of his former dorm mates actually contacted me as well. I was also contacted by another East Central student who told me that she used to see Jared Murray walking around on campus and how to this day it still haunts her. In episode 70, I covered the outbreak. And this episode was about a hepatitis C outbreak that occurred at an endoscopy center in Las Vegas, Nevada. And the details that came out about this case were just horrific. I had so many people leaving comments and sending me messages saying that they were scheduled for an endoscopy or a colonoscopy, and how after listening to the episode, it made them a little bit nervous about going in for that procedure, which I felt really bad about because they're just very routine procedures. And this was a very isolated incident, I think. I don't want to give away anybody's names or anything like that, so I'm not going to give away this person's identity, but someone who was actively involved in that case sent me an email and, told me that I was pretty spot on with how it all went down. And she also sent me an article about the Las Vegas medical mafia And if you have a chance to Google this, definitely do it if you're interested. So it's about a group of lawyers and doctors who conspired to make millions of dollars by pushing accident victims into surgeries and treatments that they did not need. Just absolutely horrifying and fascinating stuff. And, I may just do an episode on it in the future. But I thought it was cool that this person who had actively worked on that case not only reached out to me about that case, but also gave me a lead for a potential new one. In episode 35, I covered the case of the alleged real-life gone girl. Denise Huskins was kidnapped from her boyfriend's home while they were sleeping in Vallejo, California. She turned up a few days later, I think it was about 400 or so miles away, and Vallejo police did not believe her story about having been kidnapped. And in fact, they straight up accused her of making it up, her and her then boyfriend at the time. They gave a very public press conference saying as much, and later it would turn out that she really was kidnapped, and her kidnapper was then tried and convicted. So this was a case that always just kind of blew my mind because I just felt so bad for this woman who had experienced this horrifying kidnapping and, it just absolutely horrible what she went through. And then to have people that she thought was going to protect her not believe her. And then for them to go public with it saying that it was a hoax and then slandering her name just kind of made her a victim all over again. And after I released that episode, some of Denise's family members actually contacted me, and I'm not going to say who, but they told me that there were actually a lot of problems with the FBI's investigation as well, not just with the Vallejo Police Department. So in my episode, I had focused on the fact that the Vallejo Police Department was the one that didn't really take the kidnapping seriously, and that they had given this very public press conference. But according to Denise's family members, the FBI, was also pretty complicit in that aspect of it as well, which my episode did not get into. So, but another thing I thought was cool is that they thanked me for covering the case and said that they were happy that I did. And they used the term, "we were happy that you did." So to me, that made me think that Denise likely herself listened to it, which is a little mind-blowing, to be honest, because here I am, and I do not know her, and I'm releasing this information to the world about what I'm assuming was probably the worst moments of her life. I don't really know how to word it, but the thought of Denise listening to that episode, it just kind of reminds me why I'm doing it. You know what I mean? It's like reminds me that okay, talking about these court cases and sometimes talking about the things that go wrong with them, really is helpful to do. In episode 111, I covered a tragedy that occurred in a town called Wichita Falls. The case was about two little girls who were walking home from school and they were shot. And one little girl survived and one did not. The mother of the little girl who did survive sent me an email and thanked me for doing the episode. She said that it's been really difficult for her and her family to go through this, and that they're glad that they can now share this with people who want to know what happened. And I thought it was kind of funny that she said she had actually heard about the episode from a teacher at her daughter's school. So just kind of thinking that this teacher at her daughter's school listened to the episode and then told this girl's mom about it. Again, you never know who's listening. So those were the ones that I could think of off of the top of my head, but there are also other ones. I've heard from a patient of Dr. Teresa Severs, who wrote to tell me that Dr. Severs was a wonderful and kind person, and that she was sad that she was gone. And she said that she actually hadn't even heard that Dr. Severs had passed away until hearing my episode, which made me feel really bad because, I definitely don't want to be the bearer of such news. I've also heard from a witness whose testimony I covered in another episode. I believe that was the Kelly Cochran case. I've heard from someone who grew up near Todd Mullis's farm. And I don't know if you'll remember, but Todd Mullis was convicted of murdering his wife with a corn rake. And then more recently, I heard from somebody who grew up right near where Emmett Till's body was buried. And that was a little strange because I grew up right near where Emmett Till's body was buried. So, hi neighbor. I don't know who that was, and I don't think she knows who I am, but, and I'm also not sure about the age difference there, but it's just interesting, what a small world that we both probably grew up in the very same town. So you never know who's listening. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys have any ideas of things that you would like for me to talk about on this channel, please let me know in the comments, whether it has to do with Court Junkie or podcasting in general or pretty much anything. Let me know. Thanks for watching.